it was like a freight train for 2 hours coming by here.
Yeah, everything's shut down. There's no power in the city at all.
All the power lines, all the trees, all the big trees, either broken midway up or ripped out of the ground, across the road. It's just total destruction.
I think when day breaks, everybody will see that it has exceeded their fears.
It's just mass destruction.
Everything I own is gone. It's awful.
It's almost total destruction.
Friends of ours, houses are gone, absolutely gone.
The damage is done. We're still living.
Yeah.
And that's what we're thankful for.
It's just terrible, but we're lucky. We're lucky. I mean, we're okay, so that's all that really matters.
Very devastating to see all the time and the work that went into that house, and all the memories that we had in that house are now in the middle of the street.
I will guarantee I won't be around for the next one.
It's been 30 years since Hurricane Hugo slammed into our coast, changed us forever. I'm Chief Meteorologist Bill Walsh. You know, back then, before Super Doppler, before high-resolution models, it was a sense of community and experience that got us through.
The increased forward speed and the increased winds are making this a very severe storm.
The late, great Charlie Hall was the calm voice as the most powerful storm to hit the U.S. in decades approached. The radar was 1950s vintage, and the official National Hurricane Forecast only went out 3 days, but coastal South Carolina officials took the warnings seriously.
Please leave now. You cannot delay, because shortly it will become too dangerous to leave the Charleston area.
They issued evacuation orders and pointed all interstate traffic west, heading out of town.
All 6 lanes go only one way, and that is up away from Charleston.
Though some chose to ride out the storm at home or in shelters, thousands heeded the call, packing their bags, loading their cars, and leaving town. On TV, our maps were simple, and we had to plot the storm by hand, like this strike probability map behind me, looking all of 15 years old at the time. On that September night the hurricane hit, there were no apps, no cell phones, no internet, no social media, just television and radio to warn people that a Category 4 storm with 135-mile-an-hour winds was heading right towards South Carolina, with Charleston Harbor as the bullseye. Hugo made landfall at midnight after every television and radio station was blown off the air, except one.
This is Q107. What's going on where you live?
Our focus was keeping the generator running so that we could get the signal up to St. George. And, you know, with that, we had the hoser out back and Dr. Berry Hill out back, and trying to create a shield around the generator we had because the wind kept snuffing it out.
Iconic Charleston radio personality Michael D. was the lone voice in the dark.
It was a pretty exciting night at the radio station. It wasn't just me and the immediate staff. It was the entire radio station, spouses, pets. I mean, we had decided we were going to hunker down, and we did. So there was an electricity there.
And as the storm was raging, he even brought a little levity to help a scared audience make it through by answering the phone, Domino's Pizza.
The poor soul was frightened, and he called, and we just decided to answer the phone, Domino's, and first thing we told him was, we're not going to honor that 30-minute delivery time tonight because it's just not going to happen.
Back in 1989, this building wasn't even here. This is the National Weather Service office in Charleston. The old building, which is about 100 yards away, the roof came off on that incredible night. Steve Rowley talks about the difference in the technology.
The improvements we've made in hurricane forecasting all center on the modeling. And the modeling is just a simulation of what's going on in the atmosphere, and there are so many more simulations available now that we have a much better idea of what the possibilities are with any given hurricane as it approaches the coast.
And that possibility always exists for another hurricane, but 30 years later, Hugo still remains the benchmark.
afternoon or the day before the storm hit at midnight. I felt the responsibility to convince people that this was a killer hurricane and use the time they had to get out of harm's way.
The storm surge is extraordinary. This is will be the largest, most severe hurricane in anyone's memory.
People don't want to leave. It's a pain in the neck to leave. My biggest fear was loss of life.
If there's a single soul out there that doubts the fury and the death and destruction that this storm is capable of, they should now be convinced.
After the storm, it was a full court press 24/7 to get the city back in operation, to help people, because the longer it takes to begin successfully the process of recovery, the more damage that is done. Damage to people, because we didn't want the citizens to feel defeated. We've gone through something difficult. What you saw was so much good being done. When people were knocked down, they got themselves up, but they wanted to help their neighbor. It was very inspirational. Human spirit. You're challenged, you recover, and don't just think about yourselves, you think about others. The hurricane didn't win, the community won.
Right now you are taking a bird's eye view of downtown Charleston, more specifically the intersection at East Bay and Calhoun Street. I'm Michael Higdon here along with the legendary Bill Sharp, and it's a very significant location because it is the original location where the Live 5 studio was. Before we get into the details of covering Hugo, the beforehand, the night of, as well as the aftermath, is there really one specific moment that you remember of that entire thing?
Michael, I do. When Charlie Hall, our beloved weatherman that night, brought in his last update from the National Weather Service, and I saw in his eyes and on his face it wasn't good news, and I saw how devastated he was, I knew then our lives were changing like they had never changed before.
There's a way to do it. Our engineering department will get us back on the air.
We were all hoping for some good news, that he would bring in an update and it would say, well, it's veering off to the right, or it's curving away from us. We never got that. We just got some more information.
Well, you're not going to want to see this, Bill.
All right.
I'll just hand you this.
I got quiet, which I never do. And that's when I shook his hand and said, Charlie, all the best to you. Good luck. And he said, Bill, good luck to you. All right, I guess it's time to say goodbye, Charlie.
Okay.
Let's wish him good luck.
And we hope to be back on the air as rapidly as our engineering department can get us, and good luck.
We hope you all weather this well. That's it from our studios in downtown Charleston, folks. We're now closing up shop. We hope to see you sometime tomorrow, as early as possible. My last thoughts were, I've never been through anything like this. God help us all.
Now, Bill, after you and Charlie signed off on that Thursday night, you had to leave downtown Charleston not knowing what it would look like when you came back. You went to a secondary location, started broadcasting just a couple of days later.
About 2 days later, Michael, we started broadcasting. We couldn't get into the television station on East Bay downtown. So we started broadcasting from the base of our tall tower. Folks, because of a lack of proper facilities, we're going to have to show you that schedule on paper that we have pinned up on the wall behind us. But at least we were on the air, Michael.
Bill explains once they were finally allowed back downtown, he was not expecting what he saw.
I was driving for my first morning back on the air to simulcast. When I get to Marion Square, where we are now, and the National Guardsmen were all over the place. This was martial law here, and I looked down King Street, and they were lining King Street down this way.
And while he says it was unnerving to see the response, he was thankful.
But I also felt gratitude to these guardsmen because they were preventing looting.
Bill explains while the physical damage was awful, things could be rebuilt. He says it was what people went through mentally and emotionally that really has stuck with him all these years later.
I remember one day I just looked at the damage several days after the fact, and I just broke down and cried.
Has going through that shaped you into who you are today?
Absolutely, absolutely. Made me a stronger person, a better person, and a grateful person that it really hasn't happened again like that. Michael, nobody ever wants to live through a hurricane like Hugo.
It's for the safety of the people that we cannot allow them to come in right now.
When people living on Sullivan's Island and Isle of Palms heeded the call to evacuate, no one expected how hard it would be to get back home. Authorities on both islands declared martial law and called in the National Guard to deal with looters and maintain safety in the devastated area.
We prefer that no island residents come on the island until we get set up.
It meant limited access, even for people who could prove they lived there.
Now this is my property. All these people here, all they want to do is go in and save their property.
Hugo took the Ben Sawyer Bridge out of commission, and the Isle of Palms connector, it didn't even exist back then, leaving island neighbors cut off from their homes. Some turned to private watercraft to check on their houses and boats, but the military was serious about keeping them out.
With guns drawn and in the air, we were chased away.
Eventually, officials arranged ferry boat rides for people to check on their property.
It's approximately going to take all these people 45 minutes to walk to their houses. They've been told that they have 2.5 to 3 hours on the island. They should have literally 15 minutes or half an hour at their houses.
Some residents found damage made even worse by rains that happened after the storm.
No group of looters, given the number of people that are over there, could have possibly do the amount of damage. It's incredible. It's the worst case of a city management I've ever seen anywhere.
The roads are impassable. There's wires in the street. There's debris, trees uprooted, old oak trees, refrigerators are in the tree.
But while the destruction was a source of anger for some and heartbreak for others, it was also a reminder of what mattered most, the things that could not be replaced.
I just thank the Lord that I have my life, I have my wife and family, we're alive.
Though many people took the warnings to evacuate seriously, there were others who wouldn't or couldn't leave their homes.
And once Hugo roared in, the only thing they could do was to ride out the storm.
The duplex was right here, pretty much on the same footprint.
John Bench lived here on the Isle of Palms, just 2 blocks back from the beach at 28th Avenue and Cameron Boulevard.
I really didn't want to evacuate. I had everything here, all my boats, and I really should have gone.
John was all by himself that night, his wife and daughter off to Columbia. He was on the phone when it started to get bad.
And I heard a window break in, and I told them I had to go at that point in time. On the right side, one of the palm trees had blown over and had gone through the wall.
As water and wind gushed in, John nailed shut the door to that room and to the front of the house.
And as I peered out, I could see the torrents of water rushing down the street on 28th Avenue.
John boarded himself up into his daughter's room.
I did think I was going to die that night.
Pulled out a piece of notebook paper and scribbled out a will.
It was just to let people know that who I was, and I took that into my wetsuit and kept it with me.
With his surfboard at his side, John planned out an escape.
If the storm surge would have gotten up as high as I thought it would have, I would have gotten on my surfboard and ridden the surge down to the recreational department.
But it wouldn't come to that because the water had reached its height.
It was not quite up to my knees, so it was right up about here.
As the sun rose, spotlighting the damage, John spent the following weeks picking up just like everybody else.
There was a pile of debris right here that was at least 6 foot high.
And then, 10 days later, John's family came back home.
My wife and my daughter, I can remember them walking up the road, and that was probably the best sight I've seen ever, to see their faces again and hold them in my arms again. Ah.
And Hugo changed the landscape of both towns on either side of this bridge, the Ben Sawyer Bridge.
The Mount Pleasant of today looks very different than it did the night the storm made landfall.
Living here my entire life, it is the only major hurricane I've ever seen.
The year Hugo hit, Cheryl Woods Flowers sold houses. The day after the storm, there was very little untouched inventory left.
And certainly, you know, Mount Pleasant, we didn't have the devastation that they did on the islands. My friends on the islands, they were just looking for a picture, looking for something, because their homes were gone. I mean, there's still foundations over there where houses were removed by the water that have never been built back. I thought, like everybody else thought, that property values were going to be really hit hard, and they were in some places, but I think that what it did was it brought a resurgence of people renovating. New things were built. A lot of money came into the area, as you can imagine, because of all the devastation. I mean, every truck was a framer, a roofer, a painter, and a lot of money was spent. There was a huge influx of dollars.
The bustling Mount Pleasant that you see today is far different than the pre-Hugo community.
Well, in 1989, a house in Old Mount Pleasant, maybe in the Indian Village, was probably worth 50, 65, maybe 75,000 at the most. That house, same house now, is over 500.
Woods Flowers stops short of giving Hugo credit for the Mount Pleasant residential explosion, but admits it was a catalyst.
People were going to move here anyway because of the baby boomers retiring, selling the expensive properties where they came from and buying cheaper here, buying taxes. When I tell people what their annual taxes are, they say, well, is that per month? No, that's your whole, that is everything. Because they're paying 10, 15, 20, they're paying income taxes in the cities, and so that's what's driving the train.
It wasn't only homeowners who took a hit with damage from the storm. Many business owners were reeling too.
And coming up, we'll talk to a Mount Pleasant man who rode out the storm to protect his source of income. In its wake, Hurricane Hugo left behind about $7 billion worth of damage. Some people stayed behind for their families, others their homes, and a few put their lives on the line for their business.
We grew up here, never left, so we weren't leaving this time.
Chris and Diane Kyle also had a company to look after. Now a Mount Pleasant staple, Chris's dry cleaning had only been in business for a few years at the time.
2 days prior to the hurricane hitting, we knew it was real. Started getting ready. Bought enough plywood to go over all the windows at our old location. Only came home with 2 though, so we weren't as covered up at home.
But still, the Kyle's home became a bit of a refuge with their 2 kids and 2 other couples riding out the hurricane together.
The storm started coming back up. We got in the hallway, closed all the doors, took the light fixture out, took the mattresses, and hunkered down underneath the mattresses until the storm was over.
And then once we went outside and saw, it was like walking into a war zone, you know? With all the power lines down, there was no sound, no birds, nothing. Remember the silence? And it was like, oh my gosh.
Their storefront was down and out for weeks on end with no power. That is until linemen from Florida got into town.
When we did open back up, everything was wet, full of sand. We had to do clotheslines out back between the trees, hang them to air dry before we could process them.
That very picture still hangs in a frame at their newer location along Coleman Boulevard.
It was amazing. I mean, you don't forget, you know. I hope I never go through that again.
In Mount Pleasant alone, the debris burn pile after the storm was 20 feet tall, 50 feet wide, and 1/2 mile long. The town says it took 6 months to clean up.
I
there's so many friends that have no place to stay. Everything they own is gone.
While no one could question the catastrophic impact of Hurricane Hugo in cities like Charleston and the Isle of Palms, the folks in rural areas faced a 1-2 punch after the storm. Not only did they suffer extensive damage, help was slow to come, if it came at all.
We've asked for different things to come up. They say, well, it's on the way. Then they tell us that it's in Charleston. Come to Charleston and get it. Well, we don't have...
you can't go to Charleston
and get it.
All along the barrier islands and as far north as Myrtle Beach, people told the same story.
We haven't been on the news. We can't get radio stations from Charleston or only Charleston.
And farther inland in towns like St. Stephen and Bono.
All they hear on the radio is Isle of Palms, Isle of Palms, Isle of Palms, and they don't get no relief.
In smaller, less populated towns and communities, low-income families lost everything, often with no insurance to repair or replace their homes.
Did you have any insurance?
I didn't have nothing. I just worked long enough to pay for it, and this happened. That's my luck. It's ruined me.
As little as these people had, they've got nothing now.
And when looters set in, few local law enforcement agencies had enough officers to drive them out.
We have people who are sleeping at night by the doors with pistols and guns that are scared to death because all we have is full-man police department, and it's not enough.
Hugo made landfall in the small Charleston County fishing village of McClellanville with a 17-foot tidal surge and decimated not only people's homes, but their livelihoods too.
The crab and shrimp industry is just completely gone.
Trawling boats lay strewn across the land. Oaks toppled, homes flattened, but the spirit of the people unyielding.
The damage is done. We're still living.
Yeah.
And that's what we're thankful for.
The man who was the leader of McClellanville during Hugo is still the mayor of this fishing village today. I take a walk down memory lane with Mayor Rutledge Leland III for a look back at Hugo and how his town has rebounded 30 years later. 30 years after Hugo, Mayor Rutledge Leland says McClellanville is thriving.
We've got all the businesses going again. We didn't really lose many people. A couple of families said, you know, we think we'd rather live somewhere else. But all the local people that were living here then got rebuilt, and they're back here. We're actually experiencing a little bit of a building boom now.
He's been mayor of the fishing village town for more than 40 years now.
Went right the length of the creek and tore down several other docks.
But walking along this dock 30 years ago, on the day after Hurricane Hugo, would have been impossible. Hugo had destroyed it, as it did much of the town.
We just had a real mess when we woke up the next morning. All we could see was downed trees and limbs and boats upside down all over the place, and houses, and some of the houses actually were gone, but most of the houses were still standing but had been flooded.
Leland says Hugo's 15-foot storm surge decimated the town. At this point, we're standing in front of his seafood business along the waterfront. This picture shows where a 68-foot trawler landed right where we're standing.
On the far end of town, out near the Intercoastal Waterway, some of the houses were actually just gone completely. They're completely demolished and really just little pieces of rubble sitting around.
No lives were lost, but there was no electricity or phone service. The National Guard moved in immediately to protect against looters, and FEMA was in town within 48 hours.
We had volunteers coming in to bring food and that sort of thing, probably within 48 hours, maybe a little longer. Depended on exactly where you were. We had a caravan of trucks come down from New Jersey with water and ice and food of every imaginable kind, clothing. They were really amazing.
But even as help arrived, there was still a very long road to recovery.
And we had electricity probably available within about 30 days, but people really weren't able to use it at first because all the houses had been underwater and had to be rewired before and electricians were obviously stressed to a breaking point.
Slowly but surely, things did get better and back to normal. And if the town is ever hit again by another storm as powerful and in the same manner as Hugo, people are better prepared for it.
Of course, we have a lot more FEMA regulation. As a result of Hugo, we have to build our houses 15 to 16 feet in the air.
Homes also must have impact-resistant windows and meet other federal requirements.
It's expensive. It's brought the cost of a house up, no doubt about that. But we found out why you do it.
Lincoln High was the designated safe place for McClellanville residents the night of Hugo. But it turned out to be just the opposite. The people who spent the night here thought they were going to die. Marie Facine was a girl when Hugo roared into town. Everyone but her dad decided to head to Lincoln High that Thursday evening.
I was only 10 years old, so it was kind of a fun day, you know, almost like a sleepover, you know, everybody with pillows and blankets.
Marie and her family were assigned to the band room located at the back of the school. They headed that way around 8:30.
We could hear the wind outside. Occasionally the door and the windows would rattle. But again, we were just playing games and having fun, almost like a sleepover.
Around 12:30 that night, everyone started to settle down and go to sleep. But about 30 minutes later, water started seeping under the door.
At first, it started coming in very slow. And then the band room actually has steps down, so the water started filling the very bottom of the band room area. And at that time, we started stacking tables and chairs, and that's where we started to stand on top of tables and chairs.
In some parts of the school, people were putting their children in the ceiling to keep them out of the water. Marie was standing on a chair on top of a table.
The water actually got up to probably almost to my shoulders at that point in the band room area. And then remember, we didn't have any electricity, so it was also very dark. So not only are we, you know, the water's coming in, but it's also dark. You can't really see who's next to you, what's next to you at that point. So yeah, it was very scary.
Marie wasn't going to be able to keep her head above water for much longer, and her mother knew it.
She was standing on top of the table next to me, and as the water began to rise, she grabbed me and put me on her shoulder.
Marie stayed perched on her mom's shoulders for about an hour and a half until finally the water started to recede a little and she could stand on her own again. The entire night they were standing on tables and chairs in Hugo floodwater.
We sang, we prayed, yes ma'am. We sang, we definitely sang and we prayed.
And although no one ever said the words out loud, death was on everyone's mind.
I did not think we were going to make it through the night. It was just that scary. And of course, for a 10-year-old at that time, to think that, you know, you're probably going to die, not even really knowing what dying means at that point, it was just terrifying. It really was.
This plaque marks the official water line inside Lincoln High that night. Look how high it is over Marie's head even now as a full-grown adult. McClellanville Mayor Rutledge Leland says emergency officials thought the school would have been a safe place for a shelter.
It's a long way from the water, and nobody would have ever thought that that would be a problem. But as it turns out, it was not that high above sea level, and the water came in from the northern part of town and came right into Lincoln.
The mayor says because of what happened here at Lincoln High, there's no longer a designated shelter here in McClellanville. Instead, folks are simply urged to get out.
I'm Caitlin Stansel from downtown Charleston. As crews were evacuating Live 5's former station during the height of Hurricane Hugo 30 years ago, the coverage was tossed to Debbie Chard, who was reporting from the Center of Emergency Operations.
We now go back live to Debbie Chard at the Emergency Preparedness Office in North Charleston. Debbie?
Bill, we are here live at the Emergency Preparedness Office. That's off Leeds Avenue in the north. I remembered the responsibility was tremendous because it was life-saving information that people needed to know what was happening with the storm.
Debbie remembers that night as a traumatic one.
The winds were so strong. There was storm surge in downtown Charleston. There was flooding, boats in the streets. Life changed dramatically.
From the front lines of the damage,
there's virtually nothing left,
to makeshift sets.
And those supplies include canned goods, clothes, and blankets.
Debbie worked to provide life-saving information to those who stayed behind, including her own family.
The only thing I could do was pray, and I prayed all night long.
Like so many others, Debbie's kids struggled to understand what Hugo left behind.
My children, especially the youngest, had a difficult time dealing with the challenges and the changes in their lives. The schools were used as shelters, so kids didn't go back to school right away. Families couldn't go back to work because their kids were out of school.
But it was the community's response that stands out the most.
We spent a lot of time in the aftermath on the air 24 hours a day telling people where they could get essentials. When there was a shipment of batteries coming in, when there was a shipment of water coming in, when there were, where the Salvation Army had a feeding station. All of that information, we kept working to make sure that the recovery efforts could continue in the Lowcountry.
A recovery that took years to complete and an impact that will last a lifetime.
It was not a night that any of us ever want to live through again.
Right after the disaster hits, you need not a bureaucratic, procedural, red tape, anything. You need action.
For thousands of people suffering in the aftermath of Hurricane Hugo, action from the federal government couldn't come quick enough.
We got a bad government, that's all I can say. They're lying to the public.
This crowd's supposed to be geared up to get the help to the people, and they've absolutely been obstructionists.
With homes damaged by wind, rain, and storm surge, and no power for days or even weeks, people desperately sought help to meet their most basic needs of food, water, and shelter.
It's total chaos, really. Confusion. Where do we go? What do we do? We appreciate you guys. Thanks a lot.
Volunteers answered the call. Local churches, the Red Cross, even everyday people drove across the country to help.
I feel the people down here need help, and I figured I wasn't doing nothing back home. I might as well come down and give them a hand. I think any time a disaster hits in any way in the world, really, but especially in the United States, that the people, it's just the American way to want to come and help.
Even as supplies trickled in, the demand kept growing, and so did the lines. People waited for limited gas and rations that ran out before everyone could get help.
That is precious gas that they had to use to come here, to stand in line, to say that there's nothing.
No ice, the milk's going to be bad within a matter of hours.
In the end, help came from within. Neighbors helping neighbors made all the difference.
People are helping people. I mean, that's the only way we can get through it.
Oh, we've seen people so grateful. They're sharing, and it's just a community, fellowship community here.
God has his way of doing things and a way to bring us together.
Hurricane Hugo affected almost everyone in the Lowcountry in some way. Many lost their homes while others were struggling to find food and gas and power.
But that didn't stop many volunteers from helping their neighbors, even though their own lives were being affected after the storm.
Gail Bourne has spent most of her life serving and helping others.
That's basically been my whole career, is to how can I assist you? How can I help you? What can I do for you? So being with Red Cross is a natural for me.
It was that same push to serve that led Bourne to the Red Cross in 1986 to become a volunteer. Fast forward to '89, and Bourne would help after one of the biggest natural disasters the Charleston area had ever seen. She was assigned to do disaster assessment after Hurricane Hugo.
We went out in pairs, went house to house. Sometimes it was hard to match up the names and the numbers because a lot of the numbers were blown away. There's a lot of debris around.
Bourne's assessment area was in Charleston County, mainly in North Charleston, but her work also took her to some of the hardest hit areas as well. Areas like Johns Island, where houses were under trees and power lines were snapped like toothpicks.
Some people had structural damage and they just simply could not be in their houses. As far as damage, yeah, there was a lot of damage. It's just more than you can believe, like a war zone.
Longtime Red Cross volunteer Terry Cornerin says her mission to help during Hugo was as a shelter manager for North Charleston High School. She says one of at least 20 shelters the Red Cross opened up during the storm.
The thing I liked best about the shelter was the residents. They were nice, even though they were stressed.
At the height of the storm, Canarin says her staff moved the more than 800 shelter residents from the gym into the high school for safety and better protection as the wind started howling and getting stronger.
Some of the residents decided to go into the stairwell, which the ceiling fell down on them.
Canaran says thankfully all of the shelter residents were okay, and once the sun came up the next day, many went back to check the damage to their homes. She says her own home had some downed trees and shingles ripped off the roof and no power for weeks, but she says that was minor compared to the devastation she would see in other areas like where she grew up on Sullivan's Island.
I was in tears, and I just knew it'd be a while before we could get back there to visit. I think it took me about 2 years to get back over and look and see, what was left or what's been done to revitalize it.
Bourne and Canaran say they never thought twice about volunteering and staying during the storm to help others.
Somebody has to be there. We're trained to be here.
30 years after the storm, Bourne says she still sees reminders of Hugo, but also signs of continued hope.
I saw McClellanville. Yeah. I saw what the storm surge went through, yeah. That was devastating. The forest that we have now, occasionally if you ride 17, you'll see one tree far off in the distance that's much higher than the rest. That's a Hugo survivor. All the other is new growth.
Volunteers were among the heroes during the storm, along with countless doctors and nurses who answered the call to duty during the Category 4 hurricane as it came in like a freight train.
Here at MUSC, the doctors stayed with their patients even during the worst of Hugo's fury. As some people hurried out of town, others raced to work.
My family packed up and left, went to Hollywood with my parents, and I came to the hospital.
Dr. Fred Crawford was chief of surgery at MUSC in 1989. He still remembers the evacuation warnings from the chair of Charleston County Council, Linda Lombard.
If you do not leave and you are stranded, you risk not only your own life, but those who are sent to rescue you.
And the look in her eyes told me all I needed to know. She was terrified.
The hospital immediately started planning for a worst-case scenario.
Everybody that conceivably could be discharged were discharged.
Other patients were transported to hospitals around the state.
That left us with a sort of a hardcore group of people who couldn't be transferred, and that's the sickest of the sick.
Patients, young and old, many in intensive care, braced for Hugo's arrival.
It really went from a very nervous, cautious look at the storm approaching, and then absolute pandemonium when the windows started breaking.
Dr. Fred Tecklenburg was on staff in the pediatric ICU when Hugo's wrath took hold.
Literally, as we walked through the doorway, the window broke open, and the wind and rain at 140, 150 miles an hour started coming into the ICU. One infant literally was being blown by the wind in their crib.
We had to move all their patients from their rooms out into the hallways.
Nurse manager Rhonda Flynn remembers the moment the eye of Hugo passed and the moment the backside of the storm approached.
The fear that we were all living under, wondering if the building could take another hit of the storm. It was very scary.
Well, there was a point about that time that I didn't know whether we were going to make it or not. The hospital was vibrating with the wind.
The hospital lost power. The generators failed, leaving patients and staff in the dark.
Someone had the foresight to give out about hundreds and hundreds of flashlights. For several hours, we were hand ventilating patients by flashlight.
After surviving the night, the morning delivered a harsh wake-up call. The damage was widespread, and the tough part of their job was just beginning.
I was at the hospital for another 2 days before I could leave. So I didn't know what my home looked like. I couldn't reach my husband.
It was close to a month, 6 weeks before we were back, to normal, if you can say normal.
I think it's a one-in-a-lifetime, I hope, situation, particularly for a hospital.
Dr. Tecklenburg, who is the current Charleston mayor's brother, by the way, credits everyone in the building for coming together to help the hospital recover and help the Lowcountry heal.
There was a concert down at the Customs House. The Charleston Symphony played, and there were a few thousand people gathered. And it was just one of the most moving events that I recall in my personal history in Charleston, how people came together as a community and just breathed this collective sigh of relief that we'd made it. You know, we'd made it through this incredible struggle together.